Assalamu alaikum viewers, this is General Sarwar and you are watching Sarwar's Chronicle. I recall an excellent statement made by Mark Twain. He said, buy land, they are not making it anymore, which is so true. Land asset never depreciates as it has an infinite value, but land wasn't valued the same way it is valued now. During the prehistoric era, which is from 2.5 million years to 1200 BC, human beings lived in caves and wandered around in small groups. It's in the early agricultural communities which is again 10 to 8,000 years before, the human being started using iron tools in agriculture and got settled in sedentary way of life. That's when a much closer ties between human being and land, including the notion of land ownership, started evolving. Even if you look at the wilder elements, they also have a sense of territory. If you look at the lion prides in the African jungles, every lion pride has their own territory, and which is ranging from 20 to 400 square kilometer depending on the availability of food, and they would do anything to defend their own territory. However, since the Hindus had been living in this region for many thousand years, the land right inherits much to the Hindu religion and mythology. In the early Vedic era, which is from 1500 to 1000 years before the birth of Christ, the Aryans, who are believed to be of Indo-European or Indo-Germanic descents, lived on cattle grazing. And in those days, cattle used to be considered as the index of wealth. Still, the land ownership was community-based. Then came the concept of village community, where many people lived, and the land ownership still remained the same. During the king's reign, the land ownership or the right of land rested in the hands of the king. It is particularly during the voyage of Chinese traveler Fa Yin, who made an epic travel to India, coming across from the Himalayas in search of authentic Buddhist scripture during Gupta period between 399 to 414 AD, also saw the king had the sole ownership of land. Sanskrit mathematician Kattayan also advocated king's ownership over all land during the post-Gupta period, starting from 500 to 750 AD. According to him, king had the right to 1/4 of the proceeds of all lands, and he also acknowledged the user as its owner. A similar sentiment has been expressed in Narasithi, which is part of Dharma Shastra written some 2400 years before. According to Narasithi, if a family has been enjoying the fruits of a land for 3 generations, they would own the land. However, the king had the power to transfer land from one household to the other, disregarding the individual right. Contrary to this, Hindu scripture Narsingh Puran clearly says that the land belongs to the king, not to the farmer. Another Chinese traveler, Yuan Sheng, who visited India from 627 to 643 AD during the reign of King Hossain, also admitted that land belonged to the king. So we can see that during the start of the ancient era, lands were community-based, but coming towards the end of the ancient era, we find that land was owned both by the king and the individual. From the discussion, it appears that in the start of the Middle Age, land used to be owned by more than one entity, and quite understandably that caused much of the disputes between them. A similar situation prevailed in Europe, particularly after the Norman invasion in 1066, when William, the Duke of Normandy, conquered England and got hold of all the land. He established a system of land holding by which land used to be granted in return of services they provided, and the feudal system was introduced in England that took nearly 600 years to be abolished. In India, under the Muslim rule, Delhi Sultanate continued in the reign from 1206 to 1526, during which land management has undergone huge transformation. Lands were classified into three categories, namely Khalisa land, Ikta land and Inam land. The Khalisa land used to be under the direct control of the Sultan, and as such the revenue extracted from those lands were used for the Sultanate. Then is the Ikta land. These were given to the officials who used to get their salary for the services they provided from the revenue extracted from those lands. And Inam lands were given to the religious preacher or the religious institutes. During the Mughal period, the land right remained unclear, but the land ownership was shared by both king and the individual. But there was no concept of total ownership of land. Particularly in the formative years, Delhi emperors could not manage time to look after the land, and it was only Akbar who divided the land into Khalisa land and Jagiz land. The revenue extracted from the Khalisa land went to the treasury and was used for the expenditure of the estate, and Jagiz lands were given to the Jagiz or the Mansubdars. The Jagiz and the Mansubdars, on the other hand, used to get their salary from the revenue extracted from the lands they received. Along with them, there were a huge number of jamindars. Particularly, there were three categories of jamindars. These jamindars essentially worked as tax agents to the emperors, and there were two types of farmers. One category of farmers, they used to till their own land, and the other category, they used to till somebody else's land. So we can see that during the Mughal period, there has been several claimants for the same piece of land, and taking chances on the crumbling Mughal empire, these tax agents, they grabbed huge territories and they started claiming themselves as the jamindars. When the British arrived on Indian soil, there were a whole lot of problems. Initially, the East India Company wanted to operate in low profile, but the existing administrative structure was failing to cope up with the renewed power structure. Particularly, they were failing to meet the demands of the British Parliament. British Parliament in particular was very unhappy with the revenue status of Bengal. Taxation was something that inseparably linked with the land rights. Nobody can rightfully trade land without being owner of the land. Driven by this idea, in 1786, Charles Cornwallis was sent out to India, who worked very hard on the land settlement issue. His ideas harvested capitalism by destroying the age-old village community system in the Bengal economy or the agriculture. East India Company created a structure as that of landlords in England and thought of implementing it by providing land rights to the local chiefs, who came to be known as jamindars. That is how the permanent settlement came into being in 1793. They primarily wanted to ensure revenue collection. The payable tax by the jamindars was fixed in perpetuity and to be paid in money by abandoning the barter system of trading. The jamindars could sell and buy land. The peasants had no contract with the state. Alongside the land settlement, Charles Cornwallis also introduced the judicial system to adjudicate the disputes that would inevitably follow in the wake of land right intervention. In 1799, the company passed some stringent regulations under which the jamindars were given some arbitrary powers to forfeit the lands of the farmers and also forfeit their agricultural produce in the case of failing to pay the tax. This is when the money lenders class, they came forward, apparently looked like saviors. They came to rescue, but in the long run, these money lenders tied the peasants with huge debt burden. Since any increase in the land productivity was not subject to increase of taxes, it was expected that jamindars would be motivated to go for huge or maximum production and improve the quality of the lands and the peasants, but practically things didn't work out in that way. As per the settlement, the company was to get 10 parts out of total 11 parts, and the 11th part was the jamindar's remuneration. Anything produced more than 11th part was not subject to increase of tax. As such, if there was more production, the zamindars would have more remuneration. But practically, the zamindars never spent this money on the development of land or for the development of the peasants. So the resulting impact was that these zamindars, they piled up all their wealth in cities and left the villages out of financial or economic activities, and this has caused enormous misery of the rural peasants. In fact, the underlying fact is that the British wanted to create a faithful class who would serve the British interest, and it has been proved during the rebellion of 1857 when these zamindars class, they exactly paid back their white masters by not lending any support to the rebellious forces of Hindu-Muslim forces of Bengal. Permanent settlement divided the Bengal communities into two mutually hostile communities as zamindars and the peasants. These zamindars were the favorite children of the British imperialists, and they were very few in numbers. But the British, in fact, gathered the support of few at the expense of many. By adopting this policy, East India Company also saved huge money and manpower, those were necessary for carrying out the revenue collection and also for carrying out assessment of the tax or revenue from the farmers. And they were employed in other sectors like judicial or in the administrative purposes. The policy had other facets like the zamindars. They had to deposit a fixed amount of revenue on a particular date before the sunset, and failing to do that, the land would have been auctioned off through open sale, and this how it opened the opportunities for others to buy land. And in those days, particularly the Indian industrial sector was drying up or it was decaying, when whosoever had money in their hands, they thought of investing in land. Rather, investing in land was the best option. By 1820, almost one-third of the land was sold out just because of the defaulting zamindars. In those days, especially the zamindars' relatives, servants, the babus, clerks in the East India Company, then businessmen, merchants, bankers, they have all purchased this land, and they have joined this so-called new club of zamindars. These new zamindars started living in Calcutta, far from village or the rural areas. They adopted affluent life, picked up English, and with it, some problems followed, of which the problems of absentee landlordism was the most important one. The worst thing that followed was the practice of sub-feudalism and the employment of middlemen in discharging the role of this emerging zamindars being far away in the cities. Basically, the impact of this culture caused much misery to the farmers of the Bengal. This rentier class formed an intellectual society in Calcutta, and they have been successful in establishing contact with Western culture. This literate class of gentry people came to be known as Bhadralok, some of whom led the Indian nationalist movement in the late 19th century. Although it has been debated, or it can be seen very critically, that they have played a very dormant role during the 1857's rebellion. These same Bhadraloks resisted very strongly against the British regime or the British colonial masters, particularly when they divided the Bengal in 1905. And they have shown pathways to the Indian National Congress to wage a pan-Indian anti-British movement, particularly articulating Swadeshi movement and boycott movement. Until the second decade of 20th century, these Bhadraloks dominated almost all spheres, to mention the politics, economic and cultural space. Since 1920s, the political domination of these Bhadralok declined because of the Montagu-Chelmsford reform of 1919, under which the Muslims and the civil caste of Bengal were empowered to elect their own representative in the Bengal Legislative Assembly and Bengal Council. This political reform eroded the Bhadralok identity because of the converging interest of the Bengal Muslims and the civil caste communities. To overcome such predicament, the Bhadraloks, they started the communal politics in India, particularly by creating communal riot in 1926 over a very silly issue. They even started blaming the Muslims for or started branding the Muslims as the enemies of the Hindus. To establish their hypothesis, they even started blaming the Muslims because of the Mughal tyranny carried out against the Hindus. After the Roundtable Conference in London, the British Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald, he announced the Communal Award.
Finally, I hope, and I trust and I pray,
under which the minorities of Indian region were empowered or authorized to elect their own leaders, and under this reform, particularly during the 1936-37 election in Bengal province, Sher-e-Bangla A.K. Fazlul Haq and his Krishak Shramik Proja party came out successful and established a coalition government with Bengal Muslim League and with other independent legislature. That really changed the political scenario in the United Bengal. Sher-e-Bangla A.K. Fazlul Haq's pro-peasant reform, including he being the exponent of two-nation theory, created a very clear Hindu-Muslim discord in the Bengal region, and by then the Bengal society was divided on the communal basis or on the communal line, giving rise to Hindu-Muslim nationalism. The scale of violence in the preceding years, including the geopolitical realities following the Second World War, all being very hostile to UK interest or the British interest, they found no other option but to hurriedly divide India and depart. Exactly, that's what happened. With this, I have come to the end of the talk. I hope you liked it. Goodbye and Allah Hafiz.